People who took part in failed clinical trials. What were the worst symptoms you experienced and how bad did they get? CALGB 10801. Did a number on my liver, but I don't have leukemia now, so I will take it. Phase I clinical trial for a skin cream designed for emergency burn care. Half the participants, myself not included, started sloughing off sheets of skin like lepers. For the ones affected, their bedsheets or pajamas would pull away the top layer of their arm leg. We had only one limb treated per dosage. It was pretty gruesome, and the trial was cancelled after just a week. I spent a while worried about it happening, then assumed I was in the control group. Turns out I wasn't, but what the cream was doing was making the skin ultra sensitive to sunlight. Since I worked indoors and had just discovered Team Fortress 2, I didn't get enough sunlight to trigger the side effect. Gaming saves lives. I took part in a trial of a malaria vaccine. The vaccine didn't have any side effects, but I did have to sit with a couple of mosquitoes on my arm biting me. Also, I got malaria. When I was in grad school, I volunteered to be in an experiment at the dental school. I needed to get a wisdom tooth out, and the deal was that they would test out a new filling material and at the end they get to keep the tooth. And I would get $300 and free dental work. After the first week it started to hurt. After the second week the dentists were saying to take more than a double dose of ibuprofen and keep taking more unless my ears started ringing. By the time 3 weeks were up, there were moments where I had to sit down from the pain. 6 months after they removed the tooth, I was back for a checkup. I asked the dentist if the experiment was a failure and she sort of smiled and said that it was going into wider clinical trials. That's when I realized that I had been part of the control group, valiantly proving that cavities hurt. One of my friends went in for a research study. He got paid $4,500 to try out a new med for an issue he was having. I think it was an insomnia treatment. I'll have to ask him. Anyways, now he sweats 100% of the time and has to drink over a gallon of water a day to remain reasonably hydrated. Not worth MO. Hyperhidrosis. Poor guy. Not quite a clinical trial, but in the mid-80s my father was one of the first people to accept a new hay fever vaccine. He'd suffered badly year on year. Few weeks later, he started losing weight, feeling fatigued and just generally being ill. He was admitted to hospital and, after what he describes as hundreds of medical tests, failed to find any reason for why he was ill. The best they could come up with is that somehow a heterosexual man who had never used drugs or had a blood transfusion had somehow developed AIDS. Remember, this is back when it was still being called GRID. It was just assumed he'd get sicker and sicker until he died. But one day he started to get better, which also stumped the people researching AIDS because that hadn't happened to anyone else. The eventual conclusion being they didn't know what it was, but it can't have been that. Doctors basically told him he seemed fine now, just get on with his life. He went back to get the vaccine again the next year, but was told that it had been withdrawn after loads of people died after having it. Turns out it was just a massive dose of steroids. It trashed the immune system and people couldn't fight off common illnesses. Hard to prove in retrospect, but it's assumed he came close to joining them. That is fricked. I was in a drug trial for a treatment for IBD, Crohn's. The drug was modulating interleukin-11, basically trying to calm down your immune system so it quits attacking your gut. It worked really well. I was in remission and felt fantastic. Then I had my routine blood work done. You know that step where the tube is full of blood and the nurse shakes it back and forth a bit. When the nurse did that with mine, all the color drained from her face. She told me to stay where I was and sit very still, and she took off. Turns out that interleukin-11 is really good at making blood clot. When the nurse shook the tube of blood, it started clotting. That's not supposed to happen. Turns out my fibrinogen was so high that if I'd bumped my arm against the doorframe on my way out, I would have thrown a clot that would have killed me. A few doses of blood thinner later, I was good as new. The trial was stopped. I wasn't the only one who clotted up, and the research was shelved. I never have found a drug that was as effective for treating my Crohn's though. Not a failed trial necessarily, since all the data was important, but my father-in-law was a conscientious objector for religious reasons during Vietnam. The army assigned him to be an insect repellent tester. He would spend his days in an enclosed room, covered by different compounds to see how his mosquito companions would react. Some compounds worked better than others. That sounds like torture. I got a bit of a headache. They cancelled 2/3 of the study because some liver values were higher than they should have been. Still got paid out in full, living on the edge. I was in a study that was testing how people infected with a certain immunodeficiency disease, can't remember what, wasn't HIV though, reacted to bedbug bites. I was a part of the healthy control group. I went into a sterile lab, got nibbled on safely by bedbugs. They put a screen between my arm and the bugs so they wouldn't end up on me, and then recorded my skin's reaction for a week. Did this 4 times I think. I was informed they didn't find out anything significant after the study concluded. Must have been a tough paper to submit to journals. My boobs swelled up until it looked like I'd bolted basketballs onto my ribcage. Then, I started lactating. Like, a lot. Like, can't leave my house. Cause my boobs are geysers. Constantly shooting out some mystery fluid and occasionally blood. Then came the vertigo and constant tinnitus. After a few days of this, I advised the doctor the final side effect was going to be suicide if we didn't start weaning me off this crap. My parents own a research center. We have had a patient die before. The medication was in phase 3. Phase 1 being the most dangerous and patients stay at the research center, all the way to phase 4 which is supposed to be the most safe. Every time a patient dies while they are in a research study, the pharmaceutical company must send out a safety letter which is kept on site with all the names of the patients who died and their believed cause of death. We do not know the exact cause of death since we were not able to obtain any information after, but it is safe to assume that it was the medication as it had 4 patients total die. Not in our site but around the world 4 total. I forgot death could be one of the side effects. I was put on a clinical trial for my cancer. The side effects were the normal chemo ones plus risks of blood clots. I had one in my brain which resulted in a stroke at age 26. Paralyzed for 4 months. Worst experience by far in my life. Done. I tested a bladder control med that worked pretty well but caused irregular heartbeat. It was nice to not have to run to the bathroom 20 times a day, but I need my heart to work properly. Breast cancer treatment. I had 4 rounds of the typical, hair falls out, makes you puke IV chemo, then 4 rounds of Taxotere, a somewhat less debilitating chemo plus the clinical trial drug, Xeloda. The trial drug was approved for metastatic disease, which I didn't have. The Taxotere makes everything taste like soap. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with food. The Xeloda gives you killer diarrhea. I spent 12 weeks basically eating nothing. I called it the Procter & Gamble diet. I managed to choke down a chocolate milkshake once a day and had explosive diarrhea for hours after. I lost 50 pounds. Turns out the Xeloda had no effect on the cancer, but the Taxotere worked fine. I'm 12 years out from treatment. This is my line of work. Clinical trial data. And one thing to keep in mind is that an adverse event is anything that happens during the trial, whether it's related or not. Dude gets headaches sometimes? Great. Every headache during his time in the trial is recorded as an A and evaluated. And you might think, hey, I don't usually have heartburn or whatever, but I just did now and it's probably the drug, but the doctor decides that, and if there is any question there are other docs and a safety panel who will review it. I was on male hormonal birth control for years through clinicaltrials.gov. It was a huge success with minimal side effects and I wish I could get back on it. The drug worked and was safe, but ultimately it hasn't been brought to market because most men can't stand to inject themselves with an inch-long needle every week. Side effects were increased energy, fat loss, and increased libido. Not a failed trial, but I signed up for a medical study where they had to remove a lymph node from my body. They were paying $300, so I figured what's the worst that could happen, right? Well, they didn't tell me that the lymph node was going to be taken from my bikini line by a 50-year-old surgeon who had to rub iodine all over my hoo-ha. He sewed it up a little funny, so I still have a huge scar and the wound was right where my leg bent, so I walked funny for like 3 weeks. If anybody asked why I was limping, I had to tell them about my poor disfigured vag and it was terrible. 3/10 still got $300. I took part in a clinical trial for NASA where they paid me to essentially sleep for a month in one room. I couldn't go outside. couldn't leave the room, could play on my phone and go on the computer, but that was about it. I ended up sleeping probably 16-18 hours a day out of boredom. The trial wasn't technically a failure, but afterwards I had trouble sleeping usual amounts of time as well as doing day-to-day tasks. My mother-in-law participated in a large-scale trial of aspirin being tested as a cure-all for the elderly. The pharmaceutical company was trying to prove that everyone should take aspirin daily beyond a certain age to reduce blood clotting. Coincidentally, it's also a great way to sell a lot of aspirin. My in-laws were both part of the trial and my mother-in-law had some medical issues that ended up involving internal bleeding. If she hadn't been on aspirin she would have been okay, but due to the blood thinning aspect of the aspirin the problem escalated badly and she ended up vomiting blood all over her hospital room and nearly died. It's hard to describe the feelings of horror and helplessness watching her vomiting blood on the floor while nurses rush into the room from everywhere, telling you to stand back and take emergency action to try to stop her dying. One of the nurses later told us that we were extremely lucky that she lived. A few weeks after her near-death experience, a group of people from the pharmaceutical company showed up unannounced at their house and ever so gently pressured them into signing a waiver withdrawing from the trial and saying they wouldn't sue. Being nice, trusting elderly people, they signed it. We later found out that the whole large-scale trial had been canned that same day. Since they got her agreement to withdraw, it won't be recorded in any official report that the trial nearly killed her, just that she withdrew from it. The whole thing really stank in my opinion. I imagine that they want to keep their options open to run more trials in future, so they didn't want her negative result hanging over them. Yeah, anytime anyone tries to get you to sign something saying you won't sue, don't sign it. Talk to a lawyer instead. I was in a clinical trial for an allergy medication. My allergies were terrible throughout the trial, so either I was in the control group or the medication was a failure. The worst part was that my allergies were awful. I couldn't take other allergy medication and it was just not fun. I don't think I would do it for a condition that I need to be treated for, because being in the control group means you suffer. Had blood drawn repeatedly, which hurts. Also, mediocre cafeteria food. On the plus side, one of the other testies was a Vietnam vet who had crazy stories and brought in Pauly Shore movies for us to watch, Mystery Science 3000 style. I know that this isn't what you meant, but for just a brief moment, I thought one of your testicles was replaced by a Vietnam vet's testicle that had also been in a Pauly Shore movie. I'm sad that wasn't the case. I got pregnant. Trial for a non-hormonal birth control gel. First month. Used it probably 3 or 4 times. Long distance BF. We only see each other on weekends, if that. Bam. I'm 11 weeks in. It's okay. It's unplanned. I thought about terminating, but we both wanted kids, and we want to be together, so we decided to figure it out. We're both in graduate school, both graduating before the due date, so hopefully we'll be more financially secure when it gets here. The worst part is probably having to explain. I usually just say it was unplanned and people don't ask, but with my parents and close friends, I had to explain. I ended up just saying we were switching methods and things got messed up, which is the truth. Not as a subject but a research coordinator. The worst I've seen is that it didn't work. I know it's research and that if we knew it worked, it wouldn't be research, but it's still disappointing. A couple notable ones. Being on a conference call with people from other study sites and hearing the sponsor representatives sadly announce that the data analysis showed no benefit, and about how you'd be receiving closeout instructions. Meanwhile, you know there aren't real good alternative treatments for this disease, nothing that worked forever at least, and they were more painful than this, and you're just sad and disappointed, and thinking about what to say to your study patients. Another was a study of a small device to cure something untreatable and debilitating, but not fatal. Early tests showed some promise, so they got funding to expand testing. At one point, a TV show painted the results as super promising and a cure, and we got swamped with calls and spent weeks explaining to desperate people from literally all over the world about how we couldn't enroll anyone else, FDA restrictions, super illegal to try to get around, and we were sorry, it didn't work. Anyway, the inventors couldn't raise more money to try to adjust it. They went bankrupt. The assets got bought out by some company, and I think it got shelved. We were still getting phone calls a few years after it all closed out. A decade later, a better variation on the idea with surely better tech, is finally showing some real results, from what I can tell. I did a clinical trial attempting to treat Crohn's with an antibiotic. It turned my poop, pee, and even my jizz bright yellow. Come to find out, it was a dye they used in the placebo to make it match the real deal. Final year of university, I had to complete 3 unpaid practicum placements over 1 term. I had to quit my job to do so. Obviously I knew this was coming, so I'd saved a bit of money in the lead up, but not enough. And once all of my pracs were done, I was in a very bad place financially and took a couple of weeks to get a new job. I ended up doing a phase 3 trial for a new malaria drug and got paid about 2,500 Australian dollars for my participation. It was basically a biopsy to monitor uptake and liver markers across all participants. No control as such. Everyone received the drug and metabolism monitored throughout. What the frick? Thought I. I've eaten far stranger stuff in my life with no idea where it came from. About time I got paid to eat a questionable pill rather than paying to eat questionable pills. Well, this little sucker was quite questionable indeed. Single dose malaria preventatives treatments are no joke. For starters, even though it was an overnight trial, there was no sleep to be had. Least of all because they took our blood hourly. The medicine invoked some sort of bizarre half-waking fever dream state. I'm not sure how valuable the data they got back from this trial was, and somehow I'm betting the drug went to market in the end. All of their questions were about pain and they were checking liver markers, monitoring vitals etc, and little attention was given when I said that I think I might be hallucinating a little bit, or that I felt very strange indeed. Meanwhile, I'm laying in a hospital bed watching some sort of demented version of a Dark Ages bloodletting ceremony take place around me. The faces of the nurses stealing my blood took on sinister expressions and their hospital gowns shifted into some sort of nun-like religious attire. I thought one of them winked at me and was deliberately making sexual gestures towards me. I was thirsty like I'd never been in my entire life. But the water they brought me tasted like heavy metals and my paranoia told me that they were trying to poison me. If it weren't for my past experiences with psychedelics and the fact that I could clearly remember I had been administered a drug, I probably would have freaked out. This thing felt like an extremely strong deliriant. When I looked into a mirror, the skin on my face was all patchy too. And I'm pretty sure that was not a hallucination. Most others in the trial seemed to be sleeping okay, or had the foresight to bring a laptop and some movies. I was pretty much fine after a good night's sleep the next night, and the money really helped me out, but I never participated in any more medical trials. I once attended a trial for some kind of antidepressant or anxiolytic. First they injected me cholecystokinin to cause an anxiety attack and I had to evaluate the severity. It was supposed to be the maximum, 10/10, but it wasn't for me, 6/10. I realized that I have had anxiety attacks before. I was evaluated as a healthy person, but it turned out I was not and in denial about my mental health. I didn't follow to the next step. Was given Roaccutane back in the 90s when it was still being tried. Now they know that 2 out of every 100 teenagers successfully commit suicide, and I have been living with a voice inside my head telling me to kill myself ever since. My ex was on it before we met. It had probably been close to 10 years and he still lives with suicidal thoughts and cystic acne, and he's going to be 29. It's fricked. You have been visited by the ingenious Joe. Comment brain so you always see the glass half full. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.